Well, it's a cold morning here in London, England, and it's time to get back to work on the 1971 Datsun 240Z. The next steps will be pulling out the inline 6 to make way for the 5.7 liter LS1 V8.
So the first steps to getting the original L24 engine out of the Datsun is to remove all of the components that are connected directly to the engine. So we're going to start off with the ignition components like the distributor cap and the ignition coil. We're now moving on to the main battery positive lead, which connects to the starter and goes to the fuse box on the inside of the car. Heading down to the bottom side of the car, we're going to disconnect the speedometer cable. At the moment, I'm using a Hall effect sensor that sends digital pulses every time the inner shaft rotates. So we'll just loosen the large nut on the outside, and it should remove easily. So next we're going to remove the clutch slave cylinder, which is held on by two bolts that go through the slave cylinder into the transmission bell housing. Once those two bolts are removed, the slave cylinder should swing out of the way. You can also see here that one of our bolts has been replaced with an oversized bolt since it was stripped out before. For that reason, we cannot fit a normal size socket as it interferes with the cylinder itself. I just have to make do by using an open-ended wrench and just working it little by little to get that oversized bolt removed. Now we're moving on to removing the four nuts and bolts that are holding the rear of the drive shaft onto the input yoke of the differential. Once these are removed, you can slip out the drive shaft from the rear of the transmission, and you must be careful that you've already drained the fluid from the transmission, as it will leak from the rear of the transmission once the drive shaft is slipped out. Next up, we are going to remove the radiator hoses connecting the engine to the radiator. Moving to the front of the vehicle, we're going to remove the air filters that are connected to the carburetors. And once the air filters have been removed, we will move on to removing the two choke cables. Next up, we will remove the throttle cable. Now that we have our engine hoist connected to the engine, it's just a matter of slowly lifting the engine out, ensuring that you do not run into the radiator support or the transmission tunnel. You need to use the engine leveler to do so. This process is just a matter of patience and perseverance. It's a lot more helpful if you have an extra hand, but you can see in this situation, I was able to achieve it by myself.
Yep. Okay, so the engine is officially out and it's time to start prepping the engine bay. Now we're not going to do a very serious paint job here. We're just trying to utilize the time as best as possible while the engine is out. The current paint job was very haphazardly applied. There is some rust in certain areas. It's missing paint in other areas. There's oxidation everywhere. It looks terrible. So what we're going to do is we're going to come through here with some sandpaper and just level everything out as best as possible, clean up any rust, and get it ready for a fresh coat of some spray paint. Alright, so now we're just going to continue by removing all the different components that we don't need anymore. This was for emissions, some sort of positive crankcase evaporation thingamabob. This would be for the stock coil, but that is spot welded on. We'll leave that for now.
So here we are removing the voltage regulator. The original Z engine and alternator needed an external regulator, which ensured that the system was provided with a consistent 12 volts, and that made sure that the battery was not overcharged and that all of the accessories got the 12 volts that they needed. Now we will move on to removing the rest of the wiring loom. This provides a signal wire to the front turn signals, the horns, and some of the ignition components that exist on the other side of the engine bay.
Pretty good. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Do you need a photo or anything? Okay, thank you. Have a good day. Woohoo! Well, it looks like we got ourselves a delivery.
So now we're going to remove as much fluid as we can from the brake master cylinder reservoir. This will make sure that once we remove the hard lines that there will be minimal leakage. I'm going to use a hand vacuum pump to suck out as much of that fluid as possible before we move on to removing the brake booster and master cylinder. We are now going to remove the hard lines from the brake proportioning valve. This is a part by Willwood which is designed to bias the rear and the front brakes to ensure that the fronts lock up before the rear. This is used to maintain control of the vehicle under heavy braking. Now, a very useful tool to have in your tool bag when working on any braking or clutching system is a set of line wrenches. A line wrench is essentially a closed box end wrench that has a slot in it which will allow you to get over the hard line and onto that tube nut. Now this wrench is going to make more contact on that tube nut and will allow you to get more turning force before rounding off the actual tube nut itself. If you cannot gain access with a line wrench, you can still use a traditional open-ended wrench, but you do run the risk of stripping that out or rounding off that tube nut.
So, removing the brake booster is actually quite simple. It's just extremely fiddly because you're working in the most notorious spot of any vehicle to work in, which is in the footwell. Essentially, you have to contort your body as much as possible and then use braille to try and find the screws and pins you need to remove. But once you get everything out, it's actually quite simple. So there's 4 bolts holding the booster on right there, and then there's just a pin with a cotter pin that goes through it to hold it from sliding out, which attaches to the pedal assembly. The same goes for the clutch master cylinder here on the left, except it has 2 bolts instead of 4, and then you've got a pin and another cotter pin holding it in. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these, and then we're going to get everything pulled out.
So I wanted to clean up the engine bay as much as possible before putting a coat of paint on it, and one way to do this is to remove all of the original brackets that were used to hold the brake lines, fuel lines, and also the wiring harness. To do this, we're going to use a spot weld drill bit, and before using the spot weld drill bit, it is a good idea to center punch your spot welds to make sure that the drill bit itself does not walk around on you. After we've removed the brackets, you're left with a small little mound of metal where the spot weld was, and we will use an angle grinder to grind that off.
You just want to go just enough through the metal. I think I went a little too far on that one. There we go. There's another one removed.
And now that we've drilled out most of our spot welds, we're going to go over everything with the angle grinder to ensure that we smooth out any of the remaining metal. rid of all the accessories from the engine bay, and we've went over all the surfaces with some 400 grit sandpaper. We're going to tape off these remaining components like this steering linkage and those heater hoses, and then we're going to wipe everything down with some isopropyl alcohol to remove any wax or grease, and then we're going to get a coat of paint on this.
Well, it's a new day and we're back to work on the 1971 Datsun 240Z. And surprisingly, it's actually sunny today, which means we need to make the most of it. Now there's a lot to do today. I want to get the rear brake lines bent up, I want to finish the fueling system, I want to get the oil pan put onto the engine, and I want to start trial fitting the engine and gearbox. So let's get into it.
And after some late night prep, we managed to get an entire coat of paint on the engine bay. Now moving on, we need to remove the differential in order to make room so that way we can bend up our fuel and brake lines.
This is the moment of truth. Last bolt. Don't fall on my face, please. Oh, there it goes, falling on my face. Come on. Get out of there. So, the differential is out. Next step is to tear out the old fuel lines and start planting our new ones.
Okay, so we have our fuel feed and return line mostly finished. I used a corrosion resistant coated hard line that I've bent up into shape. I used the original fuel line as a template to get it into place, and then I had to do some final adjustments. I have decided to move all of the fuel lines and brake lines for this build over to the left side of the transmission tunnel because they will be terminating on the left side of the engine bay. You can see that they go up the left side here, and we will use some riv-nutted 3D printed anchors to hold that against the chassis.
So in order to install these riv nuts in this transmission tunnel, I've got myself this right angle ratcheting riv nut tool, which is a lot more compact than your typical riv nut tool, which has the long arms that you squeeze together. So this allows me to get up in here and place the riv nut exactly where we need it. Okay, so back on the bottom here, I've got my long tip marker. These are super useful if you're trying to mark holes that are kind of deep into something. I definitely recommend getting one, especially the white one, like when you're marking on black, it's just perfect. So if you look here, just take my long tip marker, go in there, and just mark around, so that way you get a good idea of where you want the hole. Just swivel it all about, and that should be good. I kind of damaged the tip of the marker. Oh well.
So now you're gonna pull your bracket out of the way. Just gonna bend these lines up and move it out of the way. There we go. And there's our mark. And now I'm just going to use this fancy right angle drill bit to punch out that hole before we put in our riv nut. Okay, so now that our riv nut is stuck through the hole, I'm gonna grab and hold the rear handle steady and twist the front handle in the direction that it will allow me to ratchet. And that will essentially crimp that riv nut down into the panel. Yeah, so you don't want to turn the rear one because that will actually spin the riv nut and that will prohibit it from actually clamping into the panel. So yeah, hold the rear one steady and then twist the front one. So now that you got the rear piece in place, you just put the top piece on top of it and then drive your bolt through it so that way it clamps down. And there it is. I still do need to run the brake line, which will be going through this small hole here, and that will be going to the rear of the vehicle. So let's do that now. So here's the original T-joint that came with the vehicle that would split our single brake line into our right and left rear caliper. And there's nothing wrong with it, so we're gonna go ahead and reuse this. And basically our brake line is gonna come up here on the left side. And then we will mount this T-joint here on this frame rail, and it should come right into the back of that T-joint and split off to our right and left rear. And now that we have our brake line in place, it's time to use our hand flaring tool to put a flare on the end of that line. And if you've ever done this before, you already know not to make the mistake of flaring the line before putting on your tube nut, because if you're doing a full set of lines, you will inevitably make this mistake. Nice. Looks good. Just clean that up with some brake clean and move on. Okay, so now that I've got the tube nut and flare on there, I'm actually gonna tighten this down onto the T-junction first and then get that in place and mark it, just so that way I have the exact position. It just seems a bit smarter than trying to mount this first and then get the length of the line 100% perfect. And then basically I'll just sway this left to right until I'm happy, mark it, and then punch a hole, put a riv nut, and bolt it in. I actually changed my mind on putting it on the left of these fuel lines, and I'm actually gonna move it further up at the right because right here will be the differential. And if we put the brake lines behind the diff,
then when we come in here to service it or do anything, we're gonna not have access to those lines, and we're gonna end up shouting and cursing. So if I move it over to the right, then hopefully I should be able to gain access here. So yeah, that's where we're gonna put it. Okay, so after a bit of fighting with this frame rail where I mounted the riv nut for this T-connector, I realized at some point when I was drilling through it that there's actually another piece of metal on the other side of it. So I had to drill through two pieces. I used my right angle adapter on the drill, and eventually I got through and got the riv nut in. But all in all, I think that this rear line is looking pretty snazzy. And I believe we should still have access from the side here when the differential is installed. So if we need to service the brakes or do any of that stuff, we should still be able to get to it. But generally, these new fuel lines and the new brake line are looking pretty good. I'll probably still massage the lines up there just to kind of straighten them out. They're a little bit wonky, but yeah, I'm pretty happy with how this is looking. So let's move on. Okay, so that is the stainless brake line all mounted up here. You can see it's all hooked into our brackets and going up to the engine bay, which I'll show you right now. Okay, so here we are in the engine bay. We got our stainless line coming in here, coming down the frame rail. And I left an enormous amount of length here just so I can have some extra to work with to get it plumbed into our Willwood proportioning valve here. So next step is to flare the ends and get the final bends made. Okay, so the daytime ran away from us, but we shall continue. The installation of the brake master cylinder and the clutch master cylinder is exactly the same as the removal, but in reverse. So basically the bolts that hold it to the firewall, and then the clevis pin that goes through to the pedal, and then the cotter pin that holds that clevis pin in place should be installed.
Okay, so that is the clutch master and brake master cylinders successfully installed into the firewall. I am now going to tighten down the flexible lines from the brake master cylinder to the proportioning valve. When tightening down any steel fitting that goes into an aluminum thread, like these ones, you want to make sure and not over tighten them because it will be easily stripped out, and if you strip out one of these fittings, you will probably end up replacing the entire unit. Okay, so I'm going to take some cardboard and start templating out where we need to fill in the gaps of our floor and our spare tire well area in order to make room for the subwoofer enclosure and the custom fuel tank that we're building. So essentially, I'll just take some cardboard here, cut out the shape, and then take that over to our sheet metal, trace out the shape that we need, cut that out of our sheet metal, and then weld it in place. Here you can see we have a panel that we've cut to fit perfectly in this notch in the top right corner. So what we're going to do is we're going to tack the corners of this to stop it from warping around from the heat, and then we're going to finish it up by stitching together the rest of the seams. Okay, so moving along with our custom fuel tank, I have some sheet aluminum here, which I'll use a hole saw to drill out for our fuel pump hanger. The fuel pump hanger that we're using is by a company called Tarks, and it came with a machined boss, which we will then weld on to the top plate. Okay, so we are now welding on the fuel pump hanger boss, and just wanted to say this was my first time welding aluminum, so I learned a lot from doing this. Some of the challenges were, for instance, the boss is a thicker piece of material going onto a thinner piece of sheet, so you need to make sure you control the heat as much as possible, as adding too much heat into the thinner panel will warp the panel. Now, I did try and mitigate that by adding a lot of tack welds around the boss itself, but even with those tack welds, I still managed to warp that panel. So in the future, if I would do this again, I would probably use some C-clamps to make sure that I held that boss down and tried to travel a bit quicker with the torch. Another thing to note here is the dirtiness of my material. Even after going over it with a wire brush and acetone, you can still see particles getting stuck in my arc and ruining my weld. So let me know if you guys want me to make a video dedicated to TIG welding aluminum, as I did learn a lot from this entire experience, and my welds are looking much better. Okay, so this is our fuel tank complete, and as I said before, this was my first time welding aluminum, so I do understand that it's a bit rough around the edges, but as long as it doesn't leak and it's strong, then it's exactly what we need. You can also see that I put a steel enclosure in front of the fuel tank where the subwoofer will slot into, and will make sure that it's level with the rest of the hatch deck. And to finish off the rear part of the fuel system, we have the feed and return line here mounted to the chassis, and we will mount the fuel filter with some elbow connections to a bulkhead fitting that will pass it through the floor into the cabin of the vehicle. Okay, so now that we have installed our feed line, we need to install our return line. I've already went ahead and marked up where we're going to punch through. It's basically just about 43 millimeters to the right. So I'm going to go in there with my center punch so our drill doesn't walk around on us. Seems pretty good. Now we got our pilot hole drilled. It's time to go in with the step bit. Perfect. So that will do it for part 1 of the LS swapped 1971 Datsun 240Z. Stay tuned for the second part coming soon, where we will start digging into the engine and getting everything mounted up. Also, be sure to like and subscribe so we can make more videos just like this.